Hello, I'm Mischievous Marcinacchio, and I own every issue of Amazing Spider-Man, Amazing Fantasy number 15, and all of the Amazing Spider-Man annuals, including one very important one, which we're going to discuss a little bit today, Dan. But still, even with that importance in mind, those annuals do not count.
Well, that might just lead us into the topic of today pretty well, considering you're writing off Annual 21 right off at the start. Mark's opinion is laid bare. Yes, I'm Dapper Dan Gavosden, and I too own every issue of Amazing Spider-Man, including those annuals, which I say definitely count. And issue 21 of that annual series is like kind of that like bee in my bonnet, or is that a positive thing? I'm not really sure, but either way, I want it to count towards my case. But alas, for me, Amazing Fantasy 15 remains a fantasy.
And that wedding issue remains a fantasy, which we're going to discuss. However, welcome to the Amazing Spider Talk, the show where two fans and collectors uncover the strange, fun, and fascinating history of the Spider-Man comic universe. Thanks for joining us for episode 2 of season 7 of the Amazing Spider Talk, The Great Marriage Debate.
If you want to swing along with us on our journey through Spidey's past, present, and future, subscribe to Amazing Spider Talk on your favorite podcast app and leave us a review to help spread the word about our show. Apple Podcasts be damned. Those reviews are important as they're our best way to spread the word about the show and indicate the size of our audience to guests and collaborators who wouldn't otherwise know, because we're listed like 17th as Spider-Man podcast on Apple Podcasts, which can't possibly be true. So, fight the algorithm, everybody, whatever that algorithm may be.
He's fighting about crowd size, everyone. He's fighting about crowd size.
Yeah.
Very unfair, very untrue. This podcast exists because of the support of our Patreon members. If you want to receive early episodes, including those from this season, exclusive artwork in the mail, and to help Dan and me keep this podcast going, go to AmazingSpiderTalk.com and consider joining our Patreon.
Yeah, in this season of the Amazing Spider Talk, we're traveling back to the late 80s and early 90s to an era of Spider-Man's history that saw his comic completely visually reinvented, with sales reaching a peak that will likely never be replicated, and a whole host of creative voices that would go to change the comics industry forever. Yes, we're talking about the early half of writer David Michelinie's run on Amazing Spider-Man, where he worked alongside the founders of Image Comics, Todd McFarlane and Eric Larson, married off Peter Parker, and introduced the world to the hottest villain in the world of Spider-Man since the Ditko days, none other than Venom.
And in this episode, Dan, we're going to be doing something a little different. Or maybe very different. In a normal episode of Amazing Spider Talk, we would find a topic and have a light, jovial discussion between Dan and myself, but that is not what's going to happen here. No. This time we are going to be doing a debate about a topic that has been the center of debate since 1987, the spider marriage between Peter Parker and Mary Jane Watson. That's right. We covered this story of their relationship and marriage in some detail both last season and in our wedding special episode from Valentine's Day 2017, where we were joined by our wives to discuss the event. We have to prove they exist, Dan, because people don't believe us. So this time we wanted to do something a little different.
That's kind of true of Peter Parker as well. But yes, Mark, we wanted to bring on a so-called marriage truther. I don't know if that's the title he's going to want to go by, but fair enough. We wanted to bring on a marriage truther to push back against our decidedly lukewarm takes about the spider marriage in the form of a debate. Honestly, my opinion is like, I could go either way. Whether he's married or not, I just want good Spider-Man comics. But I want to be clear, we didn't want to just invite on a dime a dozen troll from social media to get into a loud argument with us, but someone who could articulately argue for the marriage and how it is essential to the story of Spider-Man. So we decided that the best person to do so is our friend, who you may remember from our Race in Spider-Man episode, none other than the co-host of the Questions We Don't Have Answers podcast, Donovan Morgan Grant. Welcome back to the show, Donovan.
Hi, guys. Thank you very much for having me. Thank you very much for bringing me on this debate episode. And I hope to do my side proud and defeat Mark in the loudest way possible.
how do you feel about the term or the title marriage truther?
I mean, the marriage did happen. I think if Marvel had in every guidebook the events of One Moment in Time as the standard continuity and never mentioned Annual 21, then I would be a truther. But if that's the idea that we're going on the debate whether it happened or not, then yeah, I'm a truther. But I think right now I would say I am a proponent/defender.
Okay, cool. Well, we're really glad to have you here. And again, I said I didn't want to invite on a troll from social media. Donovan, I've always respected your opinion and you as a Spider-Man historian, and so I knew you could do us justice here and not just be one of those people that get your rocks off however you want, right? But I knew you'd offer a little bit more than just I like Mary Jane as an answer to these questions. So I'm hoping to see what you guys have to bring with this. Mark, do you have any thoughts before we go into this kind of like mano a mano tete-a-tete here?
I just, this is the second time over the past year where I feel like, I've had to I've been in in a fight or a battle, if you will. For our 400th episode, obviously you and I had our little our trivia contest, which who won that one, Dan?
I believe it was you, Mark. A stunning comeback.
Stunning comeback. Right after getting Amazing Fantasy 15 too. So it was just a doubly bad day for you. But the fact is, I might be a little over my skis here. We'll see. I haven't debated in probably about 25, 30 years in a proper way. So we're gonna see if I really bite it on this one, I think.
All right, well, let's see. I'm going to lay out some of the rules for the debate for everybody listening at home, and then we're going to get into it properly. So here's how it's going to work. There will be 8 parts of this Spider Talk debate format. Each speaker will take a turn speaking. The affirmative, henceforth known as Donovan, will speak first and lay out the topic for debate, and the negative, that's Mark, which has historically been his role on the show, will speak last with the goal of directly rebutting the topic. Following each statement, there will be 2 cross-examination periods where each participant will be allowed to ask questions of the other. Those will be followed by 2 open debate periods where the topic will be decided by the moderator, that's me. Then each speaker will be allowed 4 minutes for a final closing statement. In addition, each speaker may use up to 5 minutes of additional preparation time during the debate and in between segments. This time can be used all at once or a little at a time, which will be edited out of the final broadcast. So if you're listening at home, we skipped over it, but imagine that perhaps people prepared their statements before we kicked off the next segment. Each speaker will have to ask the moderator to use this time and indicate how much they would like to use, but only before their own speeches. The total running time of the debate is about 42 minutes, but it could be up to 52 minutes depending on how much prep time each speaker chooses to use. Participants are allowed to take notes, but they may not use the internet or other resources during the debate. Upon completion of the debate, a poll will be released on the Amazing Spider Talk Patreon page for members to place their vote on 2 distinct categories. Those categories are: who do you think made the better presentation of their viewpoint? The affirmative, Donovan, or the negative, Mark? And the second category is, whose point do you agree with? That'll allow us a little bit of insight into, hey, what's the divergence between those 2 things? If everybody went into this a marriage truther, but ultimately they find Mark's point more persuasive in the moment, we can get a little bit of a sense of that. All Patreon tiers will have access to the vote, and it will go live as soon as the podcast is published and close at the end of the 7th season. So with that out of the way, I have my timer ready, my mute button prepared, and I want to remind Donovan and Mark, as well as the listeners and viewers at home, that this is all good fun. There are no prizes for winning. The outcome will in no way affect the opinions of Marvel and the direction of the Spider-Man character, and truly, none of this matters in the grand scheme of things. And yet, we hope it is a good debate and an enjoyable listen. Are the participants ready to begin?
Let's go.
This is very unfair. No, let's do it.
All right, our first section is Donovan's, the first affirmative constructive. It's Donovan's chance to lay out his point. You have 5 minutes starting now.
Okay, thank you. My point is that the Spider-Man marriage is a story element which pluses, not subtracts, from the overall Spider-Man mythos. It is every bit as legitimate as the most famous Spider-Man stories that have resonated with fans and further encapsulates what makes him especially unique among all superheroes. If you go back to the early days, Spider-Man had a rogues gallery of love interests that he would cross paths with, and as the interactive letter pages would show, people had their fans between Liz Allen, Betty Brant, Mary Jane, Gwen, Black Cat, whoever came along. The common denominator is that people liked seeing Peter Parker enter with these women. People had their fantasies and their yearnings for who he should end up with. And it was a sort of communal understanding that, like, Peter should end up with this person. This should happen with Peter. He should leave so-and-so and end up with so-and-so. He should at least try out so-and-so. And as the large hallmarks of the Spider-Man canon are, Peter would go through a stasis period of school, of jobs, of differing social environments, but things would change. Things changed with Gwen Stacy died. People dealt with that. Some people didn't like it. Some people understood it as this would set Spider-Man apart from other characters. And eventually he married Mary Jane. The key point, I believe, is to understand what the core concept of the character is, and if his marriage to Mary Jane is threatened, if that threatens the core concept. Arguably, some of Spider-Man's most memorable adventures and storylines happened after the marriage. We have Venom, which opens up with a famous image of Mary Jane having been threatened by Venom. We have the deeply emotional storyline of Harry Osborn being the Green Goblin. We have the infamous Clone Saga. We have Maximum Carnage. We have elements that are very famous now in terms of like Spider-Man joining the Avengers much later on, his relationship with Tony Stark. None of these storylines were limited or even made to be sort of unhinged by the marriage. And so think about how his storylines are after the marriage has gone away, after One More Day and Brand New Day. You have plenty of storylines such as Red Carnage, New Ways to Die, No One Dies, The Gauntlet, Craven's First Time, I believe, Superior Spider-Man famously, Spider-Verse famously. Could these storylines have been done, or could they not have been done if Spider-Man were married? I think it's easy to argue that they could still have happened. And that's what I think is important to look at. The core concept is still there. Peter Parker still puts on a red and blue costume and is Spider-Man through these events. The marriage did not hinder that. The marriage did not hold that back. And if it's still applicable, even with being single, I believe that the marriage was not a subtractive element in his larger canon. Additionally, look at the larger franchise of Spider-Man. Mary Jane is a very popular character over the years, in large part to the Raimi films, which probably used Mary Jane as a love interest and not Gwen Stacy because she was his wife in the comic books. So you have a butterfly effect across different mediums. You have his relationship with Mary Jane in the PlayStation games. You have Michelle Jones in the MCU eventually kind of being nudged as an alternate variant to Mary Jane. You have the way his relationship with Gwen Stacy is in the Amazing Spider-Man films being very reminiscent of his Ultimate Spider-Man comics relationship with Mary Jane. True, many of those versions are not married, but it's still a loved one confidant that he goes to and relates to. This is now a part of the larger canon, a larger franchise. It's not simply the Silver Age Ditko version of Spider-Man who cries in his room alone at night. He has someone to confide into. Larger fans that come to the character with him either married or having that person by his side, and they see him as still verifiably Spider-Man. In the last decade and a half, we've had many stories of Spider-Man being single. At no point have they been restricted because he is married, except for his storylines with Black Cat. So I feel that like the marriage was an additive and non detrimental part of his canon, and I think overall it should be seen as such. It should be every bit as important as the death of Gwen Stacy.
All right. We'll call that as your 5 minutes. Thank you, Donovan. The next section is a cross-examination. This is a 4-minute section where Mark, the negative, gets to ask questions, clarifying questions of Donovan to learn more about his point before asserting his own point.
Okay.
So, Mark, if you have questions for Donovan about his point that you would like to get clarified, now would be your time to do so.
Yeah, Donovan, one of the points that you had mentioned kind of in your opening statement was how the marriage adds to the uniqueness of the of Spider-Man's character, and I'm just curious if you can kind of pull at that thread a little more. Talk to me a little bit more about what makes this so marriage a distinctive Spider-Man thing.
It's an interesting way to come at it, because obviously there are many heroes that are married. I think that something I'd like to clarify on largely is that Spider-Man is not spontaneously marrying some person. Mary Jane is a long-running character, and over the years, as we've come to experience Peter Parker and see him develop, he has seen how Mary Jane has developed. We've had storylines of Mary Jane. Oh, she's not as flighty as she seemingly was. We had the Roger Stern storyline. We see that there's more to Mary Jane than meets us, and so I would clarify that his relationship to Mary Jane is unique in that it's not a hero falling in love with a thinly rendered love interest. Peter and Mary Jane are similar in that they both have an identity balance to different audiences, and they relate to each other in that way. Their relationship is unique in that way, and that makes their relationship as a married couple more valuable. And it also reflects upon the theme of Spider-Man in terms of how the needs of your own personal needs can affect you in different environments, I think.
Now you had ran through several different stories over the course of Spider-Man history. Some of them occurred during the period where he was married. Some of them, like you mentioned, the Gauntlet, Superior Spider-Man, some of the Brand New Day era stories post-marriage. And you had mentioned would you do not believe that the marriage negated that. I mean, do you can you point to any of those stories where you feel a married Peter would have augmented those stories in some way, those post-marriage stories?
Yeah, I think that the most, in my opinion, and I think you guys would agree with this, but I'm fine if you don't. The most successful post Brand New Day story is Superior Spider-Man. It's a centennial story. It's been adapted into different media already. And I feel that, like, if Peter and Mary Jane were still married, the emotional core of that storyline would be far more suspenseful. Mary Jane was kind of like dealt with in one issue, and then she was kind of written out for a little bit, and then she was, like, slowly brought back in. But if she were in the same house as Dr. Octopus, and the tightrope that he walked when he was trying to pretend that he was still Peter Parker in Peter Parker's body, it makes the book far more compelling. And we, as we have done before in previous storylines, would empathize with Mary Jane's situation when we're also worried about what might happen to Spider-Man.
Now, do you feel that there's a distinction between the relationship being defined as a marriage versus just a romantic relationship?
I think that, especially with the different examples throughout the media that I listed, you might have it both ways, insofar as, they're just together. But I think at the same time, if they were simply together but not officially married, and people pose the question, oh, what if they were married? It would, as we've had over the course of years seeing them married, there's not much of a difference. We're talking about the marriage, and apparently saying that they are married is an important thing to distinguish. And so, okay, so it doesn't make that much difference if they are married or together. So they might as well be married rather than simply just in a relationship, because we've seen it work both ways.
Great. That's the time. Thank you. All right, let's move on to our next section, which is Mark making his declarative statement, or the first negative constructive. Mark, you have 5 minutes. Would you like time before you begin?
Nope, let's get into it, Dan.
All right, and the clock is starting now.
Thank you, Dan, and thank you, Donovan, for coming on and having this conversation. I am actually going to open my argument with someone else's words. The marriage was a disastrous mistake. That came courtesy of a guest of our show, Jerry Conway, back, I think, during the Death of Gwen Stacy episode, when we asked him about that scene in Amazing Spider-Man number 122, where Mary Jane shuts the door and opens the portal to a new kind of deeper relationship with Peter. And what we have learned over the years, and especially as it relates to the comic in question for this season, is that the marriage between Peter Parker and Mary Jane, while a story that was certainly enjoyed and revered by many fans, came about as basically a marketing gimmick. The creators involved with Spider-Man in the years leading up to the creation of the character basically kind of danced around the idea of ever having a married off Peter Parker. They felt that it would age the character because, once you're in marriage leads to children grow older, and the superhero that was initially defined by Stan Lee and Steve Ditko for his youthfulness and being a teenager in a world of adults, it would be a detriment for the long-term duration of the character. So Jerry Conway, even though he saw a lot of potential in Peter and Mary J pairing, never saw marriage as a rightful path for the two of them. Tom DeFalco and Ron Frenz have also made many public statements over the years, including to our show, where they discussed, yes, we really wanted to mature and grow Mary Jane as a character, but we never had any intentions of marrying them. Same for even David Michelinie, who was responsible for many of the initial issues of Amazing Spider-Man with the two of them were together. He came on where there was an editorial mandate from Marvel editor-in-chief Jim Shooter to do a marriage issue. The pitch that David Michelinie wrote was rejected because Jim Shooter thought it was too abstract. So what is essentially something that has been driven by marketing, while again, like I said, has been revered and loved, is it truly something that is necessary and needed for the mythos of the character? Now, as Donovan mentioned, there are plenty of examples of stories where Spider-Man's marriage to Mary Jane, or just his relationship to Mary Jane, was, these are good stories. These are stories we look back on. I mean, that image of, opening Amazing Spider-Man 300, it's one of my all-time favorite. That's one of my all-time favorite comics. And yet there are also ample instances over the years where there are quality stories that, deal with relationships, but the idea of marriage itself have, it seems inconsequential to the outcome and the execution of the story. And that's always just been, one of my core arguments. It's not that we need a specific definition to the relationships of these characters. We just need to be able to recognize these characters and tell good stories with them. I would say that it's just important to keep in mind that just because this is something that people like or can identify with, it doesn't necessarily mean that it ultimately adds to the importance or mythology of the character. It's just, these are just things that come and go. And if we can't fixate on this idea that a relationship needs to be defined a certain way, when we can also tell good stories with just two characters interacting in a romantic way or in a relationship way. I'm not an anti-Peter relationship person. In fact, I think the current relationship that he's in with Shay in the comics is quite entertaining. I like seeing Peter struggle with balancing his life, and I think you could do that whether he's married or not. Further, it doesn't also have to be Mary Jane, which I think is another point that a lot of people get fixated on when we have this debate, is that if it's not Mary Jane, it's not good enough. So that's really all I'm coming from. The people behind the character are not necessarily in agreement with this, and I think it's not a necessary additive to the character.
All right. Thank you, Mark. Now we've got the second cross-examination. In this segment, we have 4 minutes, and Donovan can ask Mark any clarifying questions that he has. So, Donovan, are you ready, or do you need a minute?
No, I'm ready.
Okay. Timer is starting now.
Yes, you said you started off saying that, like Jerry Conway said in big J. Jonah Jameson font, it was a disastrous mistake. Do you remember specifically how he described it as such, or like why he would characterize those words? Did he give an instance of what made it demonstrative as a disaster?
I'm trying to remember the total context of the interview, but my understanding was that he felt that Peter he preferred Peter in a relationship with Mary Jane, but his concerns were about the marriage itself aging the character and putting them in a position where they would have to write about getting kids or getting a divorce or whatever it is, and he just wanted to steer clear of that and keep the flexibility of the character intact with a more open, not open relationship, but a less defined romantic relationship.
Gotcha. And this is just kind of like remembering who said what. The term marketing gimmick. Were those your words, or were those words of like your previous guests, like DeFalco, Ron Ferentz?
The marketing gimmick is my phrase, but I mean it's very well known that the idea behind the marriage, and we had this interview on our show too, came from Jim Shooter basically being at a con with Stan Lee being like, oh, you should marry them in the comics, and Jim Shooter deciding to run with it and make a whole event out of it. I mean, they even did a baseball ceremony at Shea Stadium in front of my beloved Mets, and sold special comic books in bags that I passed on buying once at a comic book store. Anyway, but yeah, I mean, there was a lot of marketing and house ads around it and things like that.
Yes, that's all I have for this witness.
All right, thank you. We'll stop it there. All right, the next segment is our second affirmative construction. That's Donovan. He gets to make his case for 3 minutes. Now that he's heard Mark's case, he can relitigate, respond in any way that he would like to. You have 3 minutes to do so. Are you ready to do so, Donovan?
Yes, just brief clarification. I'm restating my case and also responding to what he had just previously said, right?
You don't have to restate your case if you don't want to. And all you have to do is just respond in any way that you can restate your case. You can ignore Mark, but as a debate, I encourage you to respond to any things that he said that you felt was a refutation of your main point.
It'll be easier if I ignore everything he says. I got you. I'm good to go.
Everything you just heard is bullshit.
Imagine you're a deer. Okay. All right. Anyway, here we go. Starting now.
Yeah. So I'm eager to jump into this. I think that when it comes to this kind of this discussion about the Spider-Man marriage, you hear a lot of recursive arguing in regards to certain topics like aging and sort of topics like marketing is a new one, but outside of the basic origins of this, because I read that Spider-Man was actually marketed as a married character, so I guess I forgot about that after the marriage. But a standard of like, oh, it's fine if he's in a relationship, but he can't be married. The idea of marriage, I think something that's not ever discussed is the number of fans who came into the character when he was married, discovered that he was married, and how many of them left and how many of them stayed. You have an entire generation of fans. I'm not going to get into the Amazing Spider Talk continuity ways of when you guys first jumped onto Spider-Man, whether it was before 1987 or not. But I came into Spider-Man in '94 through the animated series, and even though it was pre-internet back then, it did not take long for me to get my hands on the comics and say, okay, so he's married to Mary Jane Watson. And I was a very young kid at the time. Everybody I talked to has since, whether it's my family members, my other friends, other comic nerds online, who have either discovered Spider-Man similarly or would discover Spider-Man through other media like the films. When they learn he marries Mary Jane, that's not seen as allergic to them. And so age is never brought up. Age is also never brought up with other characters that are married, especially if they are characterized as young adults, such as Wally West. I mean, you can get into many other characters like Invincible or what have you. So it seems like it's not really saying anything, and that may be a differing definition of marriage. But when it comes to terms of the character, when you're recognizing Spider-Man, age does not seem to be a factor. It does not seem to be a repelling factor. why Mary Jane. I got into this in my first statement that we saw Mary Jane develop is not simply a one-dimensional supermodel that Peter decided to marry. It's an actual character with a backstory, someone who relates to him, and someone who he has fallen in love with beyond how she's characterized easily in the Stan Lee run. It's not simply a character whose job is to be a supermodel. It is a fully fleshed out character, which makes their relationship very easy to recognize and value. And we've seen that compounded over the years. It's always interesting to me how many creators have come forth saying that it was a bad idea to marry Spider-Man, but the Spider-Man comics weren't canceled. The media continued to expand. New fans continue to come into it seems that Spider-Man is a much stronger character than creators presume if they believe that the marriage was a death knell for the franchise.
All right, and that's time. Now we'll go into our second negative constructive, where Mark has 3 minutes to respond. Mark, do you want a minute to gather your thoughts, or you ready to get right into it?
Just give me 30 seconds.
All right, 30 seconds of Mark's time.
Okay, let's go.
All right, clock is starting now.
So the issue of age, I think, is just important to always note when it comes to Spider-Man, versus other characters, because, Spider-Man, or, specifically Peter Parker, is so distinct in the comic book industry as being the first, not just teenage character in comic books, but teenage lead superhero in comic books. I mean, this was something that was considered at the time very controversial. Stan Lee was even told by, his the publisher of Marvel, this won't work. No one's going to want to read about a teenager. And, lo and behold, it became their flagship character. So, that I think always needs to kind of come out first and foremost when we're talking about, Peter and his age, and why some people think that marriage is perhaps an aging element here. I mean, that is a topic of debate. Obviously, we're in a debate here to be talking about it. But, where I do see the concerns from some of these creators that talk about the detriments of marrying off the character is, kind of paraphrasing what Jerry Conway was talking about earlier. It's about the flexibility of the character. When you do put the ties of marriage around character, I mean, it does lead to some inevitable I don't say consequences, but inevitable follow-up activities that come. I mean, the most notable of which is children. And we're reading about a married with children Spider-Man right now in Ultimate, but that is a Spider-Man that is frozen in a period of time. Granted, the comics are going 1 month at a time, but we're really not looking to age the character more than a few months over the course of the story, versus where if you have a story about Spider-Man, his wife, and a child, it is something that's going to have to progress over several years. And I think if you go back to even just the very beginning of Spider-Man comics, the Spider-Man was at its Silver Age and apex when he was a story about him in high school and in college, having high school and college age problems, which were making him the most relatable. And the story and the narrative seemed to slow down tremendously in the 1970s when they kind of took him out of that. And, time became this weird factor where Peter was getting old and yet nothing around him was changing. So the marriage seemed to be something that would shake that up for sure, but there really didn't seem to be much to go with after that. And I think that's just part of the reason why we have to kind of talk about the aging element of this. No, that marriage didn't cancel Spider-Man, but it painted Marvel into a new corner that, frankly, they're still trying to paint themselves out of years later, because it was a decision that they didn't want to go forward with.
All right, and that's the time. All right, we're going to open to our first debate topic chosen by me. I'm going to present a topic, and Donovan, you'll have an opportunity to respond first. But it's an open floor for anyone to communicate here. It's a 5-minute debate topic. Please try your best to keep it on topic. We're going to get started right now.
Can I just can I clarify rules again, Dan?
Sure, yeah.
So you're going to open the topic, but it's just he'll start and then I butt in, or
correct.
Or
yeah.
So you're not going to prompt me with another question, right? It's just
nope. This
Okay.
is Donovan gets the first response, but you can jump in whenever you like. But I
Got
ask
it.
that you try to be
Respectful, of course.
respectful.
Yes,
But
absolutely.
it is an open forum, so you can audibly respond all you want and jump in. Okay.
Got it.
All right, here we go. Starting now. All right, Donovan. I think you've done a really solid job of arguing for MJ's dominance across media and as like a prominent role. I mean, obviously, not to get into the sauce here of when Mark and I got onto the book, but we both kind of entered into this era where marriage became prominent very quickly, as did you with getting in with in '94, as you said. And whether you're watching the movies or the cartoons, MJ was always the love interest, at least from that era, although things have changed over time. We've got Amazing Spider-Man movies with Gwen to kind of shake that up. But I don't necessarily think like her prominence or visibility is necessarily a case for the change, right? It's something that happened and has kind of stuck around, and we've seen a lot of it. Now, I can understand in the moment really liking the marriage, but can you tell us why, as a historian, which I would grant you the title of Spider-Man historian, what do you think it adds to the thematic idea of Spider-Man? And are those additions worth changing or updating the core concept of Spider-Man to add in this new relationship element that is kind of becomes like a new core?
Oh, that's a very interesting question. I believe that the core essence of Spider-Man is a character who, it's Peter Parker who puts on a costume and then he's called Spider-Man, and then he goes through these things. We see that character come home and then what his life is like when his costume is off. Whereas a lot of contemporaries at the time, like your Silver Age, Carmine Infantino, DC heroes, yes, they had Sylvian identities, but we didn't really care. Over time, Stan Lee and later on Roy Thomas, Jerry Conway, and the like, I don't think that halting Spider-Man's development was a prioritized concern for them. Even when Ditka was on the book, he graduated high school. He would advance in certain areas. Yes, there was a slow time down when he was in college, but he would go through things. He was a character whose life would develop, not a life that was showcased. And so I think it adds to interest and engagement in the character Peter Parker's life, not the hero of Spider-Man's franchise, although the franchise obviously benefits from this. If Mary Jane is an old girlfriend, an old love interest who, Peter's learning more of her, and she knows more about him, she knows who he is, and as they get to know each other over the years, in the 80s, they fall in love, have a wacky marriage, which we can get in the weeds of admittedly, but it feels as realistic as everything else that's happened to him. His uncle dies from not from an assassination, but in a mistake. His girlfriend dies despite him trying his best to save her. He misses his college graduation because of a gym credit. Things like that. It resonates with readers, and it has resonated with readers because it feels as believable as things that have happened before. That's why I say it's as valuable as what's happened before in terms of his core storytelling, his core storylines.
I feel like a lot of the realism when it comes to Peter and his relatability, it comes more with the misfortune. It was always, you cited a few really good examples there, like the credit, you missing out on college credit, or the death of his uncle, and kind of the misfortune, the Parker luck, that which is obviously a very core element. And I think that's something that I would also consider as a pushback against the marriage and its core concepts is with Peter, in terms of being Spider-Man and balancing his responsibilities as Spider-Man, would he ever really be able to successfully engage in a relationship of that magnitude? A marriage obviously is a huge commitment, if we want to actually capture the realism there, it's yes, obviously MJ has shown in the comics, like, I support you no matter what, but in real life, is that a sacrifice you really can expect someone like that to make? And would Peter be able to, I guess, kind of uphold his end of the relationship and grow within that relationship if he's also Spider-Man, which I think is another classic conundrum between the two characters.
So what was your So the point is, like, do you think it's not believable that he would achieve that kind of happiness?
I don't. Yeah, I don't think it's believable that Peter would be engaged in a marriage of, a relationship of that depth and based on the other characteristics of that we know of him.
This may be subjective. I think that the Parker luck and a lot of Peter's, um, recognizable misfortune is due to him being Spider-Man. Peter Parker himself is not a broken mirror that walks underneath ladders. Think of issue 50 when he gave up being Spider-Man. His life was fine. Think of Spider-Man 2. When he gave up being Spider-Man, his life was fine. But it's the call of responsibility that draws him into situations where Spider-Man can save lives. That person he saved, they're lucky now. But Peter Parker suffers because he's Spider-Man. He is not innately somebody who cannot get ahead because of who he is, as long as he is just Peter Parker. But because he's Spider-Man, things like that happen. The risk of what might happen to Mary Jane is because he's Spider-Man, not simply because he's Peter Parker. Additionally, the idea that being married is going to make his life happy, I didn't see it. I believe it's Amazing Spider-Man 314.
All right, I got to cut you off there, Donovan.
Okay, go ahead.
I gave you an extra 30 seconds there because you're making a good point, but we'll come
totally
back
fine.
to that in a moment. Okay, so now I'm going to open up our second topic for debate, another 5 minutes on the clock. This time I'm going to address it to Mark, and he'll get the first word, and Donovan can jump in. Mark, do you need any time before we go in?
No, let's do it.
All right, starting the clock now. Okay, so speaking of starting the clock, I think time is the one thing that I'd like you to kind of address, Mark. I don't think, despite all of the protestations of many of the people that you've quoted, one of the things that I think that even someone who came on as late as like David Michelinie, although now that seems like an age ago, couldn't account for was how long this character would exist, right? Or how, especially Stan and Steve had no idea that their character would go on to stand the test of time 60 plus years later. As time goes on, does it change your opinion on the value of marriage? We've for a long time complained about this lack of growth for Peter within the book. Now, marriage is certainly one way that the character could grow. Does leaving him outside of the realm of marriage 100, 200 years into Spider-Man's sequential narrative in the pages of the comics, does it start to paint a different picture than someone who's just young, but as someone that can't sustain a relationship? What do you think about that? How do you respond to the idea of time within the pages of this book?
Well, I think you got to look at it from a couple of ways. I mean, like the element of time in comics is so fascinating because, like you said, I mean, these are books, these are serial books that have been going on for, in this instance, over 60 years now. And yet, after proceeding in real time for the first couple of years, it's become this weird sliding scale. And for the most part, even though we know that it's been 12 years or something like that of time that has passed. I mean, for the most part, most of Peter's life has been most of not just Peter's life, but the Marvel universe has been frozen in this kind of moment over the last 20 or 30 years, where every once in a while some real world markers are kind of interwoven to remind people that it's still the world outside your window. And I think in that regard, it makes, as I've been saying, the marriage and the necessary follow-up activities that come harder to demonstrate in an ongoing serial versus, say, a 5-issue miniseries, like that takes a aspect of Peter's character and kind of breaks it from the continuity and can kind of show a progression, like a Spider-Man Reign or a Spider-Man life story or something like that. So I think that's the first part of it with time. The second part of it is, does marriage equate to growth? Is marriage the only way a character can grow? And I don't think that is necessarily true. I think that there are other ways to show a character growing in terms of his interpersonal relationships that don't involve a formal legal contract between two different people. So that would always just be my pushback to that, is like, yes, I want to see my characters grow. Does it have to be marriage? No, not necessarily. And especially when it comes with these other consequences in terms of the depiction of time in this series, it makes it a risky proposition.
Do you have a moment for Spider-Man that showed a level of growth that you really enjoy that's completely separate from either marriage or his relationships?
I mean, I think you had talked about earlier the Harry Osborn saga, and granted that came during a period where Spider-Man was married, but I feel like his marriage is inconsequential to the story. That's about the growth of Peter's relationship with Harry and his understanding of self versus the trauma of losing his parents and Harry losing his parents. And I feel like Spider-Man grew and matured tremendously over the course of that story, and his marriage had very little to do with it. And I think those are the stories
Mary Jane
that
does
I would
know
highlight.
Harry and vice versa, though. That's it was a callback to that era.
I understand, but I feel like the growth of the character is independent of what Peter's relationship status is. It's the growth of the character comes from the dynamics with Harry and Peter dealing with the trauma of losing his parents, and kind of, Harry's equal to that and Harry's trauma. So that's one instance. I mean, but there are certainly others I could probably point to.
With the risk of tangenting to that point, I think with Harry and Peter both married, growing past their trauma with their married partners, I would just only disagree with that instance. But I see what you're saying.
Yeah.
All right, we're done. Okay. Now we're going to move on to our final rebuttals. We'll start with Donovan with his affirmative rebuttal, and then we'll go to Mark. Each of you have 4 minutes. Donovan, would you like to take any time before getting into your final rebuttal?
I think I'm ready.
All right, 4 minutes starts now.
Okay, yeah, I have thought a lot about this topic, and I think that a lot of the regular arguments against the marriage just are facile and unthinking. I think that there is one strong argument against the marriage, and that is to suggest that Peter Parker's call to responsibility through his great power necessitates him to never engage with romantic entanglements. But to do that would be to betray a level of levity and romanticism that Stanley had set up years ago, and it wouldn't make him the fun hero that we enjoy. But it wouldn't make the most sense. But think about all the ways they've taken away the Mary Jane marriage or relationship. It's been Mephisto. It's been time dilation. It's been these sort of extra kinds of things, heightened realities, and something that's not germane to the grounded Peter Parker life of I grew into a relationship or I grew out of a relationship. I think that speaks to the kind of storytelling that Marvel would rather just have and not tell. Again, I go back to the fact that the larger media has been influenced by Peter being in a relationship / marriage with Mary Jane. You see both versions of Ultimate Spider-Man. You see the video games. You see various animated series in terms of like the 90s show For a Hot Minute. You see the way that like he relates to other characters. Mary Jane knows his identity or not. Various versions of Mary Jane. The idea of him being married to Mary Jane is not anathema to the average fan. It's primarily an argument brought about by writers who just insist that he shouldn't be married because they have a view of marriage that never really comported with fans' idea of Spider-Man. Because if you ask people at the time, oftentimes they're like, it was, the recursive, repetitive love triangles and relationships that don't really go anywhere. That doesn't feel like Peter Parker after too long of a time. It feels like they're just going back to a bygone era. The golden age is gone, the silver age is gone, the bronze age is gone. This is a modern era of storytelling, and someone who gets to know some other person and they fall in love, get married, and then continue to have his core Spider-Man adventures using great power, great responsibility. That has already happened. We've seen Spider-Man as he is married. We know what that looks like. No one at the time in terms of his fans were propelled by it, I suppose, except for those who became creators. And we've had, great storylines afterwards. there's not really a great argument in terms of the aging thing, because that's a Marvel problem. That's a Johnny Storm problem. That's a Kamala Khan and Miles Morales problem. That's beyond Spider-Man's marriage. That's not really specific to him. In terms of happiness, him being married to Mary Jane does not guarantee happiness. He suffered greatly. We've all enjoyed watching him suffer. But again, there's just not been tangible negatives against his marriage. It's all been pluses historically. We've seen it reverberate across the franchise, and I feel as though it's hard to honestly argue against it unless you specifically dig down and make it a part of his persona that he pursues intentionally. But to do that would change the character, and we don't want to talk about that. This is all about the core of Spider-Man, what he has been and what he needs to be, not what he ought to be hypothetically.
You have 30 more seconds. Would you like to take it?
Just briefly, ASM 314, he and Mary Jane get evicted. That's not due to him being Spider-Man. His marriage to Mary Jane makes Jonathan Caesar, her stalker, kick them out, and they have a very Peter Parker-esque storyline of where do I go to live at? I'm failing my wife. There isn't even a scene of him at Uncle Ben's grave saying, Uncle Ben, how do I do this? It's a very Peter Parker plot. It's not limited by the marriage. That's an example of how the marriage ensured classic Spider-Man storytelling, despite what other people might say. That was my example.
Okay. Cutting you off there. Thank you, Donovan. All right, Mark, it's time for your final negative rebuttal. Would you like any time before we begin?
Let's just get to it, Dan.
All right, starting now.
I just keep going back to all of the various creators over the years who have, kind of pushed back against the idea of the marriage. And look, I'm not going to sit here and be like, oh, well, maybe they're just being short-sighted or lazy or whatever. But, there just seems to be such an ongoing track record. I mean, we were treated to the glories of the Clone Saga in the 1990s because, the entire consortium of the Spider Office was like, how do we get Peter Parker and Mary Jane out of this book? Because we can't be dealing with a married Peter with baby, and we need a single freewheeling Spider-Man back in the main book. And then thus we got the Ben Reilly saga, which they then had to bail on because that didn't work either. So, we got some of history's worst mistakes in Spider history because people trying to undo the marriage. And, when you have a pattern of that nature, it does make you consider as the fan, okay, I'm going to be the first to admit there are many stories about a married Peter and MJ that I love, that I think are great, but is it necessarily what's best for the longevity of the book and the serial storytelling nature of Amazing Spider-Man? And that's when I consider the views of the creators here. And, in looking at those views and, what we've discussed over the course of this episode today is, in keeping Peter unencumbered in that kind of formal relationship, it just adds flexibility and kind of keeps things on a slower time scale that allows writers to go in different directions. I mean, perhaps we don't get a superior Spider-Man story if we have a married Peter. I mean, they could still do it, but it would be very different in tone. Or perhaps we don't get something like The Gauntlet if we have a married Peter, because there's just different stakes applied. And you can argue, well, it could still be a good story this way, but we were still getting good stories in this other way. And I think keeping that flexibility open and that malleability for the character, not just to grow or change or evolve as a character, but just to frankly tell different kinds of stories. Because at the end of the day, yes, he's a very human character, he's a very relatable character, but this is still a superhero saga. This is a story about someone donning a suit and with spider powers who's shooting webbing out of web shooters or organic webbing if you're Sam Raimi, and is doing his thing. And I think at the end of the day, when we're still talking about Spider-Man 50, 60, 70 years from now, that's what people are going to be coming back to is the core elements of the character in terms of who is Spider-Man, what does he do? I think the other thing that we have to consider here is that, One More Day as an event is now 17 going on 18 years in the rearview mirror. I mean, there are entire generations of fans of this character and readers of this comic, the readers that this comic has left, because we are a changing society, who don't even know the concept of a married Peter Parker. I mean, that story that you quoted, that you cited in Amazing Spider-Man 314, great issue. Love the McFarlane run, of course. I mean, these are comics that are now bordering on 35, almost 40 years old at this point. These are I wish that wasn't the case, because it ages me and it ages all of us here. But that's what's going on here, and we have to just consider that this is a thing that is a distant memory, and we have to kind of just keep moving forward and not fixating on how Peter defines his relationships with other characters.
All right, thank you. That's the end of the debate. I'm sure Donovan would love to respond to that, and Mark would love to respond to Donovan back.
I'm sure Donovan would like to punch me in the face.
But those are the limitations of the format. Now, if you at home wanted to chime in, you'll have an opportunity to discuss and vote on the final decision with a poll on the Patreon. If you're listening to this before the conclusion of Season 7 of The Amazing Spider Talk, that means the poll is still live and still open to voting. So you can head to AmazingSpiderTalk.com and click on the Patreon button to sign up and cast your vote. Also, be sure to follow the link in our description for access to our Amazing Spider Slack, where you can discuss the debate with hundreds of Spider-Man fans who will no doubt have something to say about this episode and the topic of the spider marriage. And with that, I'd like to say thank you to both Donovan and Mark for joining me this evening for this spirited debate. All right, Donovan, tell us where we can find you online.
Thank you very much for having me. My primary online output is the podcast Questions We Don't Have Answers, which I do with my friend Harrison Shute. It's a socio-political podcast where we talk about culture, politics, and also geek-related things, such as comic books sometimes. You can find that on QNoAnswers.com, QNoAnswers.com. I also am a freelance writer for DC Comics. You find that at DC.com. You can find my articles there. And yes, thank you very much for having me. I very much enjoyed it, and I'm very much interested in hearing what the listeners think.
Awesome. Well, Donovan, we always love having you on the show, and we're grateful that you took the time not only to perform but also to prepare for this. Do you want to peel back the curtain a little bit before we sign off?
I was very excited. So the moment you sent me the document, I got to work. It was almost nostalgic because it's been a while since I actually thought this hard about Spider-Man in a while. I am also from a family of lawyers. My father and my brother are attorneys, and I am a former junior high debate champion. So it was. It's not something I'm unfamiliar with, but it's been forever since I've done something like this. So I was in the lab, really working and going over certain things, talking to my buddy Josh, just thinking about things that I may have forgotten. And I could have gone on for another hour. I was pickled tink to do this. So thank you very much again.
Well, maybe if the listener feedback is so strong, maybe we'll continue it again, and I can jump in the fray to sate Mark. But yeah, look at that, Mark. You could pat yourself on the back a little bit there. We got a debate champion stepping in with you. You didn't even know.
I feel
awesome.
like Rocky against Ivan Drago here. He's like,
you're more like Jake Paul.
Yeah. Thanks.
All right. Well, thank you again, Donovan. As always, this podcast exists because of the support of our listeners on Patreon. For only $3.99 a month, you can help support our show's existence while getting early episodes, including our reviews of the latest Amazing Spider-Man comics the same weeks the comics release. These seasonal episodes weeks ahead of our public releases, exclusive artwork in the mail, and a ton of other bonuses. Plus, you'll be able to vote and determine the winner of this debate and have at least the knowledge that in some infinitesimally small way, you may have exerted some influence over the validity and future of the spider marriage. And on that note, an extra special thank you to everyone who already supports us and our work, including our newest members, Frank McCune and Nate Klinger.
Awesome. Thanks, Frank and Nate. If you value smart comics criticism and historical analysis, we hope you'll consider supporting us on Patreon. What we do on the show is admittedly niche. Still, We feel that we offer valuable commentary and model fair methods of criticism for a character and medium that deserves greater consideration and thought than it typically receives. So if these discussions and interviews and debates are valuable to you, we can only continue doing what we do with your support on Patreon. So Donovan, until we all meet up at the Coffee Bean to drink champagne together because presumably they got their New York State liquor license by now, what's our motto?
With great power, there must also come the Amazing Spider Talk!